really need a lot of proactive help from the library community understanding what the priorities really are, because there's too much work for all. I mean, even if we all decided we're going to make lists of things and divide them up, there's still too much stuff to preserve for all of the people doing preservation. So we have to figure out how to prioritize this. So if we ask the library community, how should we prioritize OA content in the big scheme in terms of what you pay money? Should it be by how much money you spend on it? Should it be according to how fragile it is? Should it be according to how it matches your collections? I mean, I feel we really need some guidance, and I would love to hear from all of you about how we should be asking for that guidance from the community.
I mean, I think it seems clear from what Kevin has been saying and what we've heard from Kate that this is really a problem, and I think publishing is similar, where it's a collective change and a collective and collaborative movement is necessary to make change. We can't do this on the institutional level. I agree. I think it's something that needs to happen at a larger level, where we're dividing up problems in ways that make sense for us to contribute in the ways that we can, instead of tasking each individual institution with figuring out what they're going to do with a website with Flash embedded in it, and whether or not they're going to publish it, whether or not they're going to preserve it, but tackling that at a much greater level. And I think we've heard about even the Scope 3 presentation we heard earlier, the real power of taking all of the stakeholders in this system and bringing them together and figuring out a different model for how the scholarly communications system works.
I have a number of thoughts, and I'm trying to decide which one to sort of pursue. I mean, there is this school of thought online that I have a bit of sympathy for, which is that if it's out there on the web, there will be copies of it, especially if it's openly licensed. Copies will be made, and they'll float around out there, and the chance of it entirely disappearing is quite slim, which is probably true, but then also the chance of it being locatable as the whole thing, like the whole run of the journal in the future, is also slimmer. So individual articles are probably floating somewhere, but can you reassemble the whole thing? So, I do think some more work is needed here. I think I'll just say a moment to sort of give the thinking behind this project I alluded to earlier, this MPAC project, to build this platform for publishing open access journals into HathiTrust. The vision here is to build this platform that is so easy to use and works so well that it's compelling enough for scholars to choose to use it, and by act of using it to publish your journal, you are depositing an archival quality copy of the articles into HathiTrust, and they will be there even if the journal ceases and goes away, that it will still be there in HathiTrust. And so if it works and catches on, I think there's a good amount of promise there. But there will almost certainly be problems in the future where, once again, someone's trying to push the boundaries on innovation, and what they want to do is not going to be preservable as such in HathiTrust, at least not without lots of work with HathiTrust to get it to that point. And so we're going to run into these tensions. People are always looking to sort of push the boundaries to try new things, right? And if they can't, work with a publisher or a library, they're eventually just going to set up something on their own. And so we're back to this sort of problem of how do we capture these most innovative things that, Catherine's most interested in and such. And it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
I mean, if I can press this thing hard enough to keep it on. I'm reminded of the struggle they had in JSTOR when they were after they had gone through all the process of getting the permissions to do scanning and preserve copies, of just assembling an entire backrun for the relevant series of journals, and even going to libraries that had subscribed to these journals over the years, it was difficult, or I remember reading reports about how difficult it was to find complete, even between multiple institutions, complete backruns of journals to digitize and scan. So maybe it's, something just inherent in reconstructing a comprehensive snapshot of a scholarly record, but especially in archives for, maybe this goes to Catherine's point, of communities that are either marginalized or early, communities, pioneer communities in some sense. It's hard to get at the informal, sort of non-standard literatures, the newsletters, the things that constituted those communities early on. We've been working on assembling this this archive of the LGBT community over the years in Dallas, and going back in time to this marginalized community that had, sort of somewhat secret newsletters that, are hard to get copies of to get access to. Well, what was the experience like in the 70s in Dallas for members of the LGBT community? Those are challenge. Maybe they're just inherent challenges in the preservation tasks of cultural memory organizations. But what strikes me as different about this is, whereas, in the print days of, going back to what JSTOR was doing, well, most libraries had subscriptions, at least, to journals. Most libraries these days don't do web archiving. We're unusual in that. We expend a lot of energy at UNT around web archiving activities. Most libraries don't do that. And, so there's not going to be that many, web archives other than the handful of places that are involved in the IIPC and the Internet Archive that have extensive web archives of anything to reconstruct any subset of the web. To go back and reconstruct any sort of scholarly community from the web, especially, and I guess they do have a lot of concerns about the open access content. That is, if we're moving towards that as let's hope a more sustainable long-term model, well, how do we have any hope of preserving this stuff?
Can I jump in from the back to say the only way we're going to have any hope of preserving that stuff is if we do it? I don't know if that's my role, but that's what I'm going to say.
I would completely agree, because, we can't just say, oh, people are going to be creative, don't know what to do with it. If people are being creative, we need to figure out a way to fit their creativity into our workflows. We can't just say, oh, we'll just not keep it, because anything we do is better than nothing at this point. And the thing that will essentially ruin digital scholarship into the future is if we do nothing. So even if you aren't doing it perfectly, anything is better than nothing. Just do something with it. Even if it's not perfect, you can always try again later, work on it, and make it better for the next people that come along.
Spencer.
I have to say, nothing is going to stifle scholarly innovation and creativity than the libraries trying to dictate the terms of that innovation. It's going to shut down that conversation. And if you're trying to provide a service, setting super narrow bounds on the service is going to be an if you build it, they won't come kind of situation.
I hear you, and in what I was articulating, you saw that it started out sounding pretty strict, and then as I got further in, it sort of got less and less strict. It was like, well, yes, accept this, but then if you really insist, well, then this, and we kept falling back. But, I think of the analogy of publishing in print today, and you have scholars who come along and they say, I've got this book, and it's this many pages of manuscript, so, in print that would come out to 650 pages, and I want there to be, there's these 50 color illustrations here, which, no, they can't be all ganged in the center as a glossy insert. They need to be spread throughout the text because it's important, et cetera, and you end up with some product that would be incredibly expensive to produce. And the publishers push back and say, we can't afford to do this as is. And you have to sort of compromise to agree on something that is viable. And so I still do think there's some room here for discussions of viability, even though, despite me setting it up as this is how it has to be, we are really trying to accommodate as best we can, but to make our work and the tasks ahead of us viable and sustainable.
Spencer, I think I agree that trying to, it's such a difficult balance to strike, and the library really, I think, in many ways is very invested in supporting innovative scholarship. I recently heard a story from a faculty editor of a journal who was going through a library publishing service that was extremely lightweight. They provided very little support for the journal, but you could basically do whatever you wanted within those confines. It allowed for multimedia, no kind of, no page length requirements, anything like that. And they eventually decided to switch over to a university press publisher for the journal who could provide them with more support, even though they did it within a lot of constraints, but they were able to provide support because because they have these very specific criteria for what you can publish. No multimedia content, a very specific page length, number of articles, this and that, and everything is very much more constrained, but it's a workflow that allows that university press to provide them with a good deal of customer service and support, whereas the library, with limited resources, the library is unable to offer kind of free reign of do whatever you want, but will also give you lots of support in doing that. And so there's a tension there just in the capacity of libraries to support those kind of really innovative publications.
Yeah. I think it might be a constructive tension if more of the scholars start jumping ship, and then the libraries are forced to contend with issues of preservation after the fact. So, if it gets Wild West, that could make it interesting. The more scholars who say, if the library, quote-unquote library publishing can't handle my project, I'm going to do it outside, and then leave preservation up to posterity. The way Born Digital Art has been doing for the last 20 years, that I think might actually be the best outcome for scholarship, at least.
The good news I can say from my experience is that actually very few people walk away from the table. I mean, we in general, when people bring to these projects, we have lots of hard discussions, but we eventually come up with something that will work, even if it ends up being something like the self-contained website. So, they're interested in working with us too because they see this long-term need.
Well, I think, everything in life is a trade-off, right? So what has been brought up a couple times expressly, but not in the last 5 minutes, I think, is collaboration and I don't know. It seems to me that part of what we're talking about with this back and forth is kind of educating each other. And like Kate brought up, the connection with these communities that we wouldn't necessarily think that information professionals would have a natural connection with. And with Kevin's, telling faculty, well, if you do this, you're going to have this kind of problem. I mean, part of this is just that here's your trade-off. We can do this, but this is what you're going to be, and so here, now what do you want to do with this? And is one component of that not kind of almost, couldn't we work in a component of contributing to the innovation by saying, we have this challenge because our authors want to do this. If they do it this way, we're going to have, as preservationists, we're going to have this problem. So, whoever, whatever the community is, help us. You're our bridge. How do we do this? It just seems like there's so many different components that don't have to be either or.
I agree. Comment back there, yeah? Question?
And I think, Spencer, maybe a portion of what you're getting at, and some of the others that have spoken as well, is I think some of this is understanding what the limitations of the publishing would be and distributing those limitations at what point in the life cycle of the information. So, I mean, if the producer of the knowledge knows well beforehand that the publisher cannot handle a certain page limit, for example, or whatever limitation you might put out, in some ways that might be more well received, where as opposed to the end, it's like, oh, well, I didn't know that there were these limitations, and now I'm putting this in your lap, and what are you going to do about it?
I definitely agree, which is why we try to have these hard conversations up front rather than having someone brought the project to us. Where this gets hard at Michigan is that we started getting this reputation as being some sort of digital innovative publisher, and so then people come to us and are disappointed when we start talking about these trade-offs, because they say, like, but I thought you were, you know, you could do all these things. And it's sort of like, well, we're trying to do it responsibly, you know. I mean, so, but they're hard conversations for sure. And yes, the sooner the better.
In Kansas City at the Library Publishing Forum, we talked about this a little bit. And, you know, it was this notion about publishers have conventionally had a mindset of filtering. And librarians have conventionally had a much broader mindset, a much more expansive, like problem solving, like we're going to help you kind of thing. And Kevin, I think your last point is a really important one. Publishers, because of the investment in human and financial capital that goes into especially monographs, long-form text, have always had to have, just with the potential for financial remuneration, but also is this something that's going to connect with a larger audience? And so we've always been in the business of no, 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 yes, no, no, yes. And that's not anything about the merits of the scholarship being done. And it's not always about, you know, can I make a buck off of this? It is this a project that with the resources applied by a conventional publisher that can connect with a larger audience? And I'm not sure that goes away. And even with, in fact, I think in some ways it's more important than ever for traditional publishers to actually have that mindset and to say, this is what we're good at, we're going to keep doing this, and the scholarly community benefits from the amplification that we do, but traditional publishers are not going to try and be all things to all people. And I just have to add a comment, which is, I feel like I've seen the counter-revolution here, because Catherine can't come to the University Press's meeting because we would all throw tomatoes at her, and now we're hearing about, like, oh, now we need a workaround because the library publishing isn't expansive enough, and so you're now, like, welcome to my world. So.
We may need to move to just a paradigm away from arguing about whether, are the publishers really important anymore? Are publishers no longer relevant because they can't do things that people are doing? Maybe we need to move away from that, thinking about versions of scholarly communication, and that there is a version of what you are doing that would be appropriate for a publisher to help you shape. And that's where the publisher's editorial and production and design work is valuable, and that there's a part of what you're doing where we're going to help you publish it for this particular audience in this particular. There may be a whole other part of your scholarship that we can't handle because it's out there, the kind of thing that Spencer mentioned that's so creative and it's got so many different ways of it being expressed that it needs to be, you need to work with someone else who's doing this kind of thing at this kind of an organization. Maybe it's a gaming company, maybe it's a library, maybe it's something we don't even know how to define yet. But instead of saying you can't do that because we can't handle it, maybe we move to a discussion that's more like, look, these are the things we can handle really well, but we have these partners we can help you connect with who handle these other things really well, and we're not going to be threatened by that. We're going to help you figure out how we serve all of your needs as a scholar, although we're not doing it as one organization. It's hard to do when you're presses have university presses. Often you had 5 presses competing for the same. Seems odd, except that's what university presses did and do. They want the best American colonial history that fits their list, even though everyone agrees it's not going to make any money. Now, if we can get over, feeling that we're all competing with each other and that we're actually figuring out partnerships to serve scholarly needs, that could be an interesting economic needs behind all of these questions.
Well, and actually to go a little further on that, I mean, if we think about collaborations among university presses who are often under pressure to not take on too many money-losing projects, and think about where they might collaborate, it's really not so much in that acquisitions, because that's where they, in fact, compete the most, but probably more on the back end, right? This is not my idea. I mean, many others have been talking about this in recent years, that you would collaborate on the work that happens after you acquire the title, that the sort of systems, productions, and workflows that you have for doing things like copy editing and design for layout and production and distribution and all are areas where the work is a bit more interchangeable between publishers, and therefore we could find ways of collaborating on this work and saving money for all of us in the process. Again, has some analogies with the world of libraries, the way that cataloging, for example, has changed so much from the pre-computer days, when you had to do so much work individually at institutions. Now it's much shared. Martin.
So I'm reminded again of sort of translating findings, practices from the analog days into the digital days, and in the world of we must not have many archivists or conservators in the crowd, because they will often, in my experience, pipe up at this point and say, well, we've always had loss, and we've always lost, and we can't preserve everything. And conservators, are sort of also in the business of trying to keep things around as long and as best they can. I'm reminded of two very different examples of one in the digital realm and one in the analog realm. In the analog realm at Oregon State University, they have the office on all the stuff from the office from the day Linus Pauling dropped dead, and what he was drawing on his chalkboard. And they've struggled with, well, how do they preserve that? Do they spray it? Do they keep the chalk is like slowly falling off the chalkboard, and they don't know what to do with it. I've talked to the archivist trying to figure out what to do with that, and they don't want to disturb anything on his desk. They want to just keep it just like it was. So, and ranging from that to a former project and effort, a set of colleagues that I worked with at Emory University when we acquired the archives of Salman Rushdie, and this big hush-hush deal while he was coming out of hiding, I guess. And well, when we actually got it, well, what did it turn out to be? It wasn't papers, it was 7 laptops. And well, what do you do with that? And archaic laptops from 13, 14 years ago, trying to keep, what do you do with that, really? Do you try to keep them running exactly like they were? How do you give anybody any access to that without letting them potentially monkey with what he had on his desktop, his digital desktop, so to speak? And so, there's some, I mean, as we innovate in scholarly productions, what's interesting to me about it is we get in between the two realms of traditional books that we, codex volumes that we stick on the shelf and preserve through benign neglect through the years, and don't get them wet and don't let them burn up, and they're pretty much okay. And this stuff from the analog archives realm of realia, of, well, how do we keep that stuff going? And it's interesting that it's somewhere in between. The folks at Virginia that tried to keep wanting to preserve all the oddball stuff that came out of the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities over the years, the Valley of the Shadow stuff, and these projects. Well, somewhere it starts to seem more like conservation, and I don't know what we do with that, but just other than maybe acknowledge both. We should do something. We shouldn't just throw up our hands. But that we also have to maybe be ready for some degree of loss in this stuff.